The rain taps against the dirty windows of a butcher shop in Brooklyn, mixing with the far-off sound of sirens that seem to always be wailing in this part of New York. Inside, under flickering lights, a man in a blood-stained white apron raises a big knife with a skilled and careful hand. But Roy DeMeo was not just cutting meat. He was making a special skill perfect, a skill that would make him the most scary killer in the history of the Mafia. Before we start this dark story through the world of crime, take a moment to tell us where you are watching from and what time it is. Are you getting ready for bed or starting your day with a true crime story? Put your city and time in the comments below. And if you are ready to learn about the scariest stories from the history of organized crime, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you will not want to miss what is coming next. In the dark parts of Brooklyn, where the smell of raw meat mixed with the sharp smell of fear, there lived a man who turned cutting meat into something much more evil. Roy Albert DeMeo did not just cut meat in his legal business. He perfected the skill of making people disappear forever, leaving only quiet stories and the scared silence of people who saw something and knew it was better not to talk. This is the story of the most feared crew in organized crime history. A story of loyalty that turned into betrayal, of planned murder that was done as well as a factory, and of over 200 killings that would make even tough criminals have nightmares. It is a trip through the darkest parts of America's world of crime, where violence was not just a tool for the job, it was the job itself. Now, let's enter the world of Roy DeMeo. September 7th, 1940, the world was at war. But in the Bath Beach neighborhood of Brooklyn, New York, a different kind of fight was starting, one that would go on for more than 40 years and take hundreds of lives. On this day, Antoinetta and Anthony DeMeo welcomed their son, Roy Albert, into a world where staying alive often meant knowing when to fight and when to hide. Bath Beach in the 1940s was a place with many Italian immigrants, families who worked hard, and the constant presence of organized crime. The neighborhood was close to Coney Island, which brought a steady stream of money, visitors, and chances to make money, both legally and illegally. For young Roy DeMeo, this place would be the perfect spot for a criminal mind to grow, a mind that would one day scare New York's world of crime. The DeMeo family was like many Italian-American families at that time. Anthony DeMeo worked hard to give his family what they needed, teaching his children the ideas of loyalty, respect, and that family was the most important thing. But in Bath Beach, these normal ideas often had darker meanings. Loyalty meant keeping quiet when the police came to ask questions. Respect was earned through fear as much as being admired. And family. Well, family could mean your relatives or the Cosa Nostra family that controlled the streets. Roy's childhood was shaped by two things: the idea of real hard work and the pull of easy money. That came from Brooklyn's secret world of making money. His father's hard work was easy to see. But young Roy could not help but see the men in fancy suits who got respect wherever they went, who never seemed to worry about money, and who talked in whispers that made grown men nervous. The Bath Beach of Roy's childhood was a neighborhood that was changing. The old Italian ways brought by immigrants were mixing with the new realities of life in an American city. Young men had choices that their fathers never had. They could try to have normal jobs, or they could follow the example of successful businessmen who seemed to own the best restaurants, drive the newest Cadillacs, and get respect from everyone they met. For Roy DeMeo, the choice seemed clear from a young age. Why work hard for many years to build a small life when the men in his neighborhood seemed to have everything they wanted just by knowing how the real world worked? It was an idea that seemed very attractive, and Roy was not the only young man in Bath Beach to follow it. By the time he was in his late teens, Roy had found a job as a butcher's helper, a job that would later become very important in an evil way. The local butcher shop where he learned his job was an important part of the neighborhood, serving the Italian-American families who wanted the best cuts of meat prepared exactly how they liked them. It was honest work that needed skill, care, and a deep knowledge of how a body is put together. Roy turned out to be very good at it. He had steady hands, a sharp eye for small things, and most importantly, he was not bothered by the sight of blood and the work of cutting up animal bodies. His skill at quickly cutting up large animals, separating the good meat from the waste, and using every part of an animal for something would later become the start of his most famous and evil new idea. The butcher shop was also like a community center where local men would meet to talk about everything from sports to business to neighborhood news. It was here that Roy first started to understand the complicated network of relationships that ran his community. Like who owed favors to who could be trusted, and who had the real power behind the normal-looking businesses. But maybe the most important thing the butcher shop taught Roy was the importance of being clean, organized, and having a step-by-step plan for doing work that other people might find gross. Cutting up a side of beef needed the same careful, step-by-step way, focus on details, and not feeling any emotions that would later describe how he handled murder. The skills could be used for other things in ways that would not be clear for many years. It was in his early 20s that Roy DeMeo first met Nino Gaggi, a respected man in the Gambino crime family who became his teacher, a father figure, and finally his link to the most powerful criminal group in America. The meeting was set up by people they both knew, who saw that Roy's mix of ambition, smarts, and not caring about right or wrong might be useful to men like Gaggi. Anthony Nino Gaggi was everything Roy wanted to be. He dressed very nicely, spoke softly, got respect, and had a quiet power that made strong men listen to what he thought. Gaggi had moved up in the Gambino family by being smart, cruel, and able to make money for his bosses. He saw these same things right away in the young butcher from Bath Beach. Meeting, Gaggi opened doors that Roy had only dreamed about. All of a sudden, he had a chance to get into lending money illegally, illegal gambling, and the kinds of business deals that were in the blurry area between legal business and pure crime. More importantly, he had the protection and support of one of New York's most powerful crime families. Under Gaggi's guidance, Roy started to understand the complex and organized way the Mafia was set up. It was not just a gang of violent criminals. It was a secret government with its own rules, ways of doing things, and set of beliefs. To do well in this world, you not only had to be willing to use violence, but also be smart enough to know when violence was needed, when it would cause more problems, and how to use it in the best way. Roy's first criminal acts were pretty small compared to what he would do later. Stealing cars was one of his first jobs. Not just randomly stealing cars for fun, but a planned way of taking expensive cars that could be quickly taken apart for parts or sent to buyers who did not ask about ownership papers and car registration. The car theft business needed organizing skills that Roy had a lot of. He needed to find cars to steal, hire people he could count on, build connections with buyers, and create ways to handle stolen cars without getting caught by the police. It was a business that needed to be done well, quietly, and with the skill to manage many moving parts at once. Lending money illegally turned out to be another job that fit Roy's special skills perfectly. The business needed a careful balance between helping people who could not get real loans and collecting money from people who might be tempted not to pay it back. Roy's big and strong body, along with his growing reputation for being cruel, made him very good at convincing people who were hesitant to pay back their loans. But it was in these early criminal jobs that Roy first started to show the things that would later make him one of the most feared men in organized crime. He was not happy just to follow the old ways of doing things. He was always looking for ways to do things better, make more money, and lower the risks. His sharp mind was always working, always planning, and always looking for a way to get an advantage over his rivals and the police. What made Roy DeMeo different from other criminals of his time was not just his willingness to use violence. It was how he felt about it. For most people, even tough criminals, violence is a bad thing that has to be done, something to be avoided if possible, and used with hesitation when needed. For Roy, violence was just another tool, no different from a wrench or a calculator. This way of not feeling any emotions about violence would turn out to be one of Roy's most dangerous traits. He could kill without being angry, without strong feelings, and without feeling sorry. Murder was just a business choice to be judged based on its costs, good outcomes, and possible results. This cold-hearted way of killing would later let him turn murder into a system in ways that scared even other members of organized crime. The mix of his butcher's knowledge of the human body, his businessman's focus on doing things well, and his total lack of being bothered by violence created a perfect storm. Roy was not just willing to kill. He was specially suited to kill better, more efficiently, and more completely than anyone else in the business. By the early 1970s, Roy DeMeo had made a name for himself as a rising star in the Gambino crime family's work in Brooklyn. His car theft groups were making a lot of money. His illegal money-lending business was growing bigger, and his reputation for being reliable and cruel was spreading through the group. But Roy was not happy with just being a successful criminal. He wanted to be someone they could not do without. He started to actively look for the jobs that other members of the group liked to avoid, the jobs that needed someone willing to cross lines that others would not cross. It was a dangerous plan that would in the end lead to him moving up in the group, and finally, to his downfall. The change from regular organized crime work to murder was not quick. It was a slow increase that showed both Roy's growing importance in the group and his willingness to take on jobs that were more and more dangerous. Each job he did well built his reputation and brought him closer to the inner group of the Gambino family's most trusted members. By the early 1970s, Roy DeMeo had shown he was valuable enough to the Gambino crime family to be given his own crew. This was not just a promotion. It was a sign that Roy had grown into the kind of leader who could be trusted with a lot of responsibility, and more importantly, the chance to make a lot of money. The DeMeo Crew started as a casual group of criminals who thought alike and who shared Roy's desire for violence and money. Unlike regular Mafia crews that might focus on one type of criminal work, Roy's group was very good at many things. They could steal cars, run illegal money-lending businesses, manage illegal gambling, and handle the kind of killing that other crews liked to avoid. The main members of the crew showed Roy's skill for finding people who shared his special mix of smarts and not caring about right or wrong. Anthony Center was a childhood friend from Bath Beach who had grown up in the same area and shared Roy's understanding of how their world really worked. Joseph Testa brought technical skills and a focus on details that worked well with Roy's leadership skills. Chris Rosenberg was young, excited, and completely willing to follow Roy's lead into more and more dangerous situations. What made the DeMeo Crew different from other criminal groups was their planned, step-by-step way of using violence. While other crews might use murder as a last choice, or when they were very angry, Roy's group handled killing with the same careful, step-by-step way they used for stealing cars or lending money illegally. Murder was not an emotional act. It was a business choice, carried out with the efficiency of a factory. The crew setting up the Gemini Lounge as their main office was a big change in both Roy DeMeo's criminal career and the history of organized crime in New York. The Gemini Lounge, in the Canarsie part of Brooklyn, looked like just a normal neighborhood bar. It was a place where local men could have a drink, watch sports, and talk with friends and neighbors. In reality, the Gemini Lounge was something much more evil. It was the main hub of Roy DeMeo's growing criminal empire. It was a place where plans were made, jobs were given out, and problems were solved in a final way that left no chance to argue. The bar's harmless look on the outside hid a level of planned violence that the people in the neighborhood, who sometimes came in for a drink, could never have imagined. The way the Gemini Lounge was built was perfect for its two uses. The main bar area was a cover for meetings and planning, while the back rooms gave them privacy for things that needed to be kept completely secret. Most importantly, the building's basement gave them the space and quiet needed for Roy's most famous new idea, the planned, step-by-step way of getting rid of murder victims. The Gemini Lounge also acted as a place to find new members for the crew's growing businesses. Young men from the neighborhood who were attracted by the success and respect that Roy and his friends seemed to have would slowly be pulled into the group's work. What started as small favors or small criminal jobs would eventually grow into being a full part of the crew's most serious crimes. In the middle of 1977, Roy DeMeo got the honor he had been working toward for years. He was officially made a member of the Gambino crime family. This was not just a special honor. It was a sign that Roy had shown he was deserving of the trust and responsibility that came with being a full member in one of America's most powerful criminal groups. The ceremony itself was a carefully planned event that stressed the serious nature of the promises Roy was making. Surrounded by high-ranking members of the Gambino family, Roy took the traditional promise of loyalty, secrecy, and obedience that tied him to the group for life. The ritual of burning a picture of a saint, while Roy held it in his cupped hands, was a clear reminder of what would happen to him if he ever broke the trust he was being given. But with the honor of being made a member came new responsibilities and things that were expected of him. Roy was put in charge of handling all Gambino family business with the Westies, the violent Irish-American gang that controlled a lot of Manhattan's West Side. This job was both a sign of trust and a test. The Westies were known for being very hard to work with, and managing the relationship needed someone with Roy's special mix of talking skills and a believable threat of violence. The job also gave Roy a chance to get into more profitable criminal opportunities and more freedom in how he chose to do them. As a made member of the family, his word was important in arguments. His protection now covered his friends, and his ability to make money grew a lot. It was everything he had worked for. But it also meant that his actions now directly affected the reputation and goals of the whole Gambino organization. Even though the Mafia traditionally had a rule against selling drugs, Roy DeMeo's crew got very involved in the drug trade during the late 1970s. This was not just a casual breaking of family rules. It was a planned business choice based on Roy's belief that the money from selling drugs was much more than the risks of being caught and punished. The drug businesses were run with the same planned step-by-step way that was typical of all of Roy's criminal jobs. Instead of selling drugs on the street, the crew focused on selling large amounts, which made the most money with the least amount of risk. They made deals with suppliers, set up ways to distribute the drugs, and created systems for cleaning the money that let them enjoy their profits without getting unwanted attention. Roy's choice to get into the drug trade showed his practical way of thinking about organized crime. He knew that traditional mafia businesses, like lending money illegally and illegal gambling, while they made money, had limits on how much they could grow. The drug trade offered chances for growth and profit that just did not exist in other areas of crime. But getting involved in drug dealing also caused problems within the Gambino family. The traditional rule against drugs was not just a moral belief. It was a practical understanding that drug dealing brought a lot of attention from the police, which could put the group's other businesses at risk. Roy's breaking of this rule would eventually add to the suspicion and fear that would in the end lead to his downfall. Roy DeMeo's first murder which he did in 1973 when he was 30 years old, was the start of a killing spree that would eventually take over 200 lives. The victim was a small-time criminal who had made the deadly mistake of trying to force one of Roy's friends to give him money. It was a pretty simple killing by organized crime standards, but it set the ways and examples that would be a part of all of Roy's later murders. What made this first killing different from typical Mafia murders was not just how well it was done, but the complete disappearance of the victim's body. While most organized crime murders were meant to send messages to possible enemies or rivals, Roy's way was different. He understood that no body, no crime, was not just a clever saying. It was a practical way to handle murder that lowered legal risks while having the biggest psychological effect. Successfully getting rid of the first victim's body proved Roy's ideas about how murder could be made better through planned, step-by-step thinking and action. Instead of just shooting someone and leaving the body to be found, Roy had created ways to make people disappear so completely that their families never knew for sure what had happened to them. The psychological effect of someone completely disappearing was often more scary than a regular murder. When bodies were found, families and friends could at least have some sense of being finished with it. When people just disappeared without a sign, the not knowing and fear lasted forever. Everyone who knew the victim was left wondering if they might be next, and if they too might just disappear one day without any explanation. Roy DeMeo's most famous new idea was creating what became known as the Gemini method, a planned, step-by-step way of murder and getting rid of the body that got rid of physical evidence, while having the biggest psychological effect on possible enemies. The method was created through trying things out and making mistakes over several years, with Roy always making the process better based on what he learned from doing it. The Gemini method started with choosing victims who could be tricked into coming to the Gemini Lounge with a false story. This got rid of the risks of committing murders in places that could not be predicted, where people might see something or evidence might be hard to control. By bringing victims to a controlled place, Roy could make sure that every part of the killing and getting rid of the body went just as planned. The actual murder was usually done with clean efficiency. Victims were usually shot in the head from a short distance to make sure they died right away and did not struggle. The spot of the wound was carefully chosen to reduce blood loss, as too much bleeding would make the later job of getting rid of the body harder. Every detail was planned and done with the care of a surgery. But it was the process of getting rid of the body that truly made the Gemini method different from regular organized crime murders. Using what he learned as a butcher's helper, Roy had created ways to completely cut up human bodies in ways that made it impossible to identify them and easy to get rid of them. Bodies were systematically taken apart into smaller pieces that could be easily moved and gotten rid of in different places. The psychological effect of the Gemini method went far beyond the people who were killed. News of what Roy could do spread through the world of crime, creating a level of fear that worked for him better than any regular way of scaring people. Possible enemies were not just afraid of being killed. They were terrified of disappearing completely, leaving their families to wonder forever what had happened to them. By the mid-1970s, Roy DeMeo's crew had grown far beyond what it was at the start. What had started as a pretty small group of criminals doing car theft and illegal money lending had grown into a smart criminal group with many ways of making money and a reputation for solving problems that other crews could not or would not handle. The crew's car theft businesses had grown to a factory-like size, with a planned way of taking high-value cars, quick handling in chop shops, and set up deals with buyers all over the East Coast. The business was so well organized that stolen cars could be completely changed or shipped to another state within hours of being taken, making it almost impossible for the police to get them back. Lending money illegally was still a main business, but Roy's crew had come up with new ideas that made them different from regular loan sharks. They offered better interest rates to get customers, but their ways of collecting money were much smarter and scarier than the usual ways. The crew's reputation for making problems disappear for good gave them advantages in collecting money that no legal bank could match. The crew had also started making and selling pornography, taking advantage of the growing market for adult movies and their connections with legal businesses that could be used as fronts for illegal work. The porn businesses not only made money directly, but also gave them chances to blackmail and force people to give them money. They created more ways to make money. The planned, step-by-step way that was typical of all of Roy DeMeo's criminal work created new and big challenges for police, trying to investigate and charge the crew for their crimes. Regular ways of investigating that depended on physical evidence, what witnesses say, and information from informants were mostly useless against a group that had gotten rid of physical evidence and witnesses so completely. The Gemini method's success at making bodies disappear meant that many of the crew's murders were never officially called homicides. Missing person reports might be filed, but without bodies, crime scenes, or witnesses, there was little that police could do other than adding names to long lists of unsolved disappearances. Even when police suspected Roy's crew was involved in certain crimes, proving that suspicion in court was extremely hard. The crew's discipline in staying quiet, along with their planned way of getting rid of evidence and witnesses, created a situation for investigators where guessing and being sure were separated by a gap that was almost impossible to cross. The crew's involvement in many types of criminal work also made it harder for the police by needing different police groups and areas to work together. Car theft cases might be investigated by local police departments, while illegal money-lending businesses were handled by organized crime task forces. The lack of working together between police groups allowed Roy's crew to operate pretty freely across different areas. Roy DeMeo's change of murder from a rough act of violence into a planned process of getting rid of humans was one of his scariest new ideas in the history of organized crime. The Gemini method was not just about killing people. It was about making them stop existing in any real way, erasing them so completely that their deaths became something to guess about rather than investigate. The creation of this method showed Roy's unique background and how his mind worked. His time as a butcher's helper had given him a deep understanding of the body and the best ways to take apart living things. His business-like way of thinking had taught him to see problems in terms of planning, efficiency, and managing risk. His complete lack of feeling emotions about violence had let him see murder as a technical problem rather than a moral one. The physical needs for using the Gemini method were carefully thought about and handled in a planned way. The basement of the Gemini Lounge was changed to provide the privacy, drainage, and cleaning abilities needed for the disposal process. Special tools were bought and kept just for the purpose of cutting up human bodies. The planning for storage and moving was done with the same attention to detail that legal businesses used for managing their products. What made the method especially good was how completely it was mixed into the crew's other work. The Gemini Lounge was both a legal business and a place for getting rid of bodies. The crew's car theft businesses provided cars for moving the remains. Their different business fronts offered chances to get rid of evidence in ways that would never be traced back to the original crimes. The actual use of the Gemini method followed a very exact order that lowered risk while making it as efficient as possible. Possible victims were usually tricked into coming to the Gemini Lounge with a false story. They might be told that Roy wanted to talk about a business deal, solve an argument, or just have a friendly drink. The familiar social place helped make sure that victims would not be suspicious or ready for what was about to happen. The choice of victims was not random or done on a whim. Each killing was the result of careful thought about things like the person's value to rival groups, what they knew about the crew's work, their potential as witnesses in police investigations, and their ability to cause problems for Roy's businesses. Murder was a business choice. It needed the same analytical thinking as any other major business choice. The actual killings were done with clean precision, meant to cause the least suffering while having the most control. Victims were typically shot once in the head from a short distance, using guns chosen specifically for how reliable they were and the kind of wounds they made. The goal was not to cause pain or send dramatic messages. It was to cause immediate death with minimal blood loss and physical damage. That might make getting rid of the body later more complicated. The time and place of murders were carefully planned to ensure privacy and lower the risk of being found out. The Gemini Lounge's basement provided the perfect place, soundproof, private, and equipped with the drainage and cleaning tools needed for what came next. The building's legal business operations provided a cover for unusual activities and made sure that people who came in now and then would not get suspicious. What happened after the actual killing was what truly set Roy DeMeo apart from other murderers. Using his experience as a butcher's helper, Roy had developed planned ways to completely cut up human bodies in ways that made it impossible to identify them and easy to get rid of them. This was not random cutting. It was a step-by-step process designed to solve specific logistical problems. The process of cutting up the body began right after death to reduce body stiffness and other things that might make the work harder. Bodies were systematically taken apart using methods borrowed from meat processing, with careful attention to separating different kinds of tissue and bone in ways that made it easier to get rid of them. The goal was to turn human remains into parts that could be easily moved and gotten rid of without being noticed. Roy's knowledge of the human body allowed him to approach cutting up a body with surgical precision. He understood which joints were easiest to separate, which bones could be efficiently broken down, and which body parts were the hardest to get rid of. This skill enabled him to complete the cutting up process quickly and completely, reducing the time that physical evidence existed in a recognizable form. The tools used in the cutting up process were carefully chosen and maintained for their specific purposes. Knives, saws, and other tools were chosen based on how well they cut through different types of human tissue and bone. The tools were kept sharp and clean, both for efficiency and to reduce the risk of leaving evidence on the remains that could be traced. Getting rid of the cut-up remains presented complex planning challenges that Roy tackled with the same systematic thinking he used in his legal business operations. Different body parts needed different ways of being gotten rid of based on their size, density, and potential for being identified. The goal was to scatter remains across multiple locations and disposal methods to ensure that even if some parts were discovered, they could not be connected to specific victims or traced back to the crew. Soft tissues were often disposed of through methods that ensured they would break down quickly and eliminate the possibility of identification. These might include burial in locations where natural processes would quickly break down organic matter, or disposal in industrial processes where human remains would be indistinguishable from other organic waste materials. Bones and teeth, which posed greater identification risks, required special handling. These harder tissues might be broken down further by machines, chemically treated to eliminate DNA evidence, or disposed of in ways that ensured they would never be recovered. The crew's various business operations provided access to industrial processes and disposal, methods that would not be available to typical criminals. The crew's car theft operations provided vehicles for transporting remains to disposal sites without the risk of the vehicles being traced back to the crew. Stolen cars used for body disposal were typically destroyed immediately afterward, eliminating any possibility that forensic evidence could be recovered from the vehicle's interiors. The psychological impact of the Gemini method extended far beyond its immediate victims to affect everyone who knew or suspected what Roy DeMeo was capable of. The complete disappearance of people created a level of fear that a traditional murder could not match. When bodies were discovered, families and associates could at least find some sense of closure and certainty. When people simply vanished without explanation, the uncertainty and terror lingered indefinitely. This psychological warfare served Roy's business interests better than conventional intimidation tactics. Potential enemies were not just afraid of being killed. They were terrified of disappearing completely, leaving their families to wonder forever what had happened to them. The uncertainty was often more effective than any direct threat in persuading people to cooperate with Roy's wishes or avoid actions that might attract his attention. The crew's reputation for making problems disappear permanently also served as a form of advertising for their services. Other criminal organizations that needed someone eliminated but wanted to avoid the law enforcement attention that typically followed high-profile murders began hiring Roy's crew for their unique capabilities. This created additional income streams while further enhancing their reputation for efficiency and discretion. The psychological impact also extended to law enforcement agencies, which found themselves investigating disappearances rather than murders. Without bodies, crime scenes, or witnesses, traditional investigative techniques were largely ineffective. The uncertainty about whether specific disappearances were even crimes created additional challenges for law enforcement agencies attempting to build cases against the crew. The Gemini method was not static. It evolved and improved over time as Roy and his crew gained experience and identified ways to increase efficiency while reducing risks. Each successful disposal provided lessons that could be applied to future operations. Techniques that proved effective were refined and systematized, while methods that created unexpected problems were abandoned or modified. The crew developed specializations within the overall process, with different members taking responsibility for different aspects of the operation. This division of labor increased efficiency while reducing the psychological burden on any individual participant. It also created redundancy in the system, ensuring that the temporary absence of any single crew member would not disrupt operations. The physical facilities used for the dismemberment and disposal process were continuously improved based on practical experience. Modifications to the Gemini Lounge's basement increased privacy, improved drainage, and enhanced cleanup capabilities. Storage and transportation equipment was upgraded to reduce the risk of accidents or discovery during the disposal process. The crew also developed backup plans for situations where the normal disposal process might be disrupted or compromised. Alternative locations were identified and prepared for use if the Gemini Lounge became unavailable. Backup transportation and disposal methods were established to ensure that operations could continue even if primary systems were compromised. As word of the crew's capabilities spread throughout the criminal underworld, Roy DeMeo began receiving contracts from other criminal organizations that needed someone eliminated, but lacked the capability or willingness to handle the job themselves. This murder-for-hire business became a significant source of income, while further establishing the crew's reputation for efficiency and discretion. The contracting process was conducted with the same business-like approach that characterized all of Roy's operations. Potential clients were carefully checked to ensure they were legitimate and would not pose security risks. The specific requirements of each contract were carefully evaluated to determine feasibility, pricing, and timeline. Payment terms were clearly established and strictly enforced. The crew's ability to guarantee complete disposal of remains made them particularly valuable to clients who needed to eliminate people without creating law enforcement problems for themselves. Traditional murder left bodies that could be traced back to motives and suspects. Roy's services eliminated those risks by assuring that victims simply disappeared without explanation. The murder-for-hire business also provided opportunities to gather intelligence about competing criminal organizations. Clients often revealed information about their own operations, rivalries, and vulnerabilities, while explaining why specific individuals needed to be eliminated. This intelligence could be valuable for Roy's own operations, or potentially sold to other interested parties. Each member of Roy DeMeo's crew developed specific skills and responsibilities within the overall operation, creating a level of specialization that increased efficiency while distributing the psychological burden of their activities. This was not accidental. Roy recognized that different personalities and skill sets were better suited to different aspects of the murder and disposal process. Anthony's center proved particularly effective at the social aspects of luring victims to their deaths. His friendly demeanor and neighborhood connections made him ideal for the kind of casual conversations that might convince someone to visit the Gemini Lounge for what they thought would be a routine business meeting or social gathering. Joseph Testa's technical skills and attention to detail made him valuable for the more mechanical aspects of body disposal. His methodical approach ensured that the dismemberment process was carried out efficiently and completely, minimizing the risk of leaving evidence that could be traced back to specific victims. Chris Rosenberg's youth and eagerness made him useful for tasks that required energy and complete commitment. His willingness to follow Roy's instructions without question or hesitation made him reliable for aspects of the operation that might cause more experienced criminals to hesitate. The specialization also created a form of mutual dependence that strengthened the crew's internal loyalty. Each member understood that their individual safety and prosperity depended on the continued success and security of the entire operation. This mutual dependence discouraged defection while encouraging the kind of careful, operational security that kept the crew's activities hidden from law enforcement. By the mid-1970s, Roy DeMeo had achieved something remarkable in the world of organized crime. He had created a criminal organization that operated with the efficiency of a legitimate corporation, while maintaining the secrecy and ruthlessness necessary for survival in the underworld. The DeMeo Crew had evolved from a small group of neighborhood criminals into what was arguably the most feared and effective killing machine in the history of American organized crime. The scope of the crew's operations during this period was staggering. Their car theft rings were processing hundreds of vehicles annually, generating millions of dollars in revenue through a sophisticated network of chop shops, export operations, and resale channels. The systematic approach to vehicle theft had reached an industrial scale, with the crew capable of fulfilling specific orders for particular makes and models within days of receiving requests. The loan sharking operations had similarly expanded beyond traditional neighborhood boundaries to serve clients throughout Brooklyn and into Manhattan. The crew's reputation for effective collection methods, up to and including making delinquent borrowers disappear permanently, gave them advantages in the lending market that legitimate financial institutions could not match. Interest rates could be higher and collection more certain when borrowers understood the ultimate consequences of default. The murder-for-hire business truly set Roy's crew apart from other criminal organizations. Word of their capabilities had spread throughout the East Coast underworld, bringing contracts from crime families in multiple states who needed problems solved with absolute discretion. The crew's guarantee that victims would never be found made their services invaluable to clients who could not afford the law enforcement attention that typically followed conventional murders. One of Roy DeMeo's most significant innovations was his understanding of how legitimate businesses could be used to support and conceal criminal activities, rather than simply operating as criminals who occasionally used legal fronts. Roy created an integrated network of businesses that served multiple purposes within his overall criminal enterprise. The crew's involvement in the pornography industry exemplified this approach. On the surface, their adult film production and distribution operations appeared to be legitimate businesses serving a legal, if controversial, market. In reality, these operations provided opportunities for money laundering, blackmail, and the recruitment of individuals who could be useful for various criminal purposes. The porn operations also demonstrated Roy's ability to identify and exploit emerging market opportunities. The liberalization of obscenity laws during the 1970s had created opportunities in adult entertainment that did not exist in previous decades. Roy was quick to recognize these opportunities and develop business models that maximized profit while minimizing legal risks. Restaurant and bar operations provided similar opportunities for integration between legitimate and criminal activities. These businesses could serve as meeting places for planning criminal operations, money laundering vehicles for converting illegal proceeds into apparently legitimate income, and employment opportunities for crew members who needed visible sources of legal income. The legitimate businesses also provided cover for activities that might otherwise attract law enforcement attention. Frequent meetings between crew members could be explained as business consultations. Large cash transactions could be justified as restaurant receipts or film production expenses. The appearance of legitimate business activity made it much more difficult for law enforcement agencies to establish probable cause for surveillance or search warrants. Roy DeMeo's position within the Gambino crime family during the height of his power was both desirable and shaky. As a made member with his own crew, he enjoyed significant freedom in his operations, while benefiting from the protection and resources of one of America's most powerful criminal organizations. However, this position also came with expectations and obligations that would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The Gambino family's leadership recognized Roy's value as an earner and problem solver, but they were also increasingly concerned about the level of violence associated with his operations. The sheer number of people who had disappeared in connection with Roy's activities was beginning to attract unwanted attention from law enforcement agencies that might otherwise have focused their resources elsewhere. Paul Castellano, who had become the family's boss in 1976 following Carlo Gambino's death, was particularly uncomfortable with Roy's methods. Castellano preferred a more business-like approach to organized crime, focusing on traditional activities like construction industry corruption and labor union infiltration that generated substantial profits with minimal violence. Roy's systematic approach to murder was the complete opposite of Castellano's vision of modern organized crime. The tension between Roy's methods and the family leadership's preferences created an increasingly unstable situation. Roy's crew was generating substantial revenue for the organization, but their activities were also creating risks that concerned more conservative members of the family hierarchy. This tension would eventually contribute to the paranoia and internal conflicts that would lead to Roy's elimination. During the peak of his power, Roy DeMeo's influence extended far beyond the traditional boundaries of Brooklyn's organized crime territories. His crew's reputation for effective problem-solving had earned them recognition throughout the Northeast Corridor, with contracts and partnerships extending from Boston to Philadelphia and beyond. The crew's car theft operations had developed into a sophisticated interstate network with connections to buyers and processors throughout the eastern United States. Vehicles stolen in New York might be shipped to buyers in Florida within hours, making recovery virtually impossible and prosecution extremely difficult across multiple jurisdictions. The murder-for-hire business brought the crew into contact with criminal organizations that might otherwise have been competitors or enemies. Roy's reputation for discretion and effectiveness made him valuable to crime families who needed problems solved without creating additional problems for themselves. These relationships generated both income and intelligence that could be useful for the crew's other operations. Roy's territorial expansion was not limited to criminal activities. His legitimate business operations were also growing beyond their original scope, with investments in restaurants, bars, and adult entertainment venues throughout the New York metropolitan area. These businesses provided both income and infrastructure that supported the crew's criminal operations. while creating an appearance of legitimate success. What distinguished Roy DeMeo's crew from other violent criminal organizations was their systematic approach to killing. Violence was not an emotional response or a tool of last resort. It was a carefully planned business operation that was executed with industrial efficiency and methodical precision. The crew maintained detailed records of their activities, including information about victims, methods used, disposal locations, and lessons learned from each operation. This information was used to continuously improve their methods and avoid repeating mistakes that might increase risks or reduce efficiency. The systematic approach extended to victim selection, which was based on a careful analysis of factors, including the person's value to competing organizations, their knowledge of the crew's activities, their potential as witnesses in law enforcement investigations, and their ability to cause future problems. Each murder was the result of a business decision that weighed costs and benefits with the same analytical approach used in legitimate business planning. The crew's methods were constantly evolving based on practical experience and changing circumstances. New techniques were tested and evaluated for their effectiveness and safety. Equipment and facilities were continuously upgraded to improve efficiency and reduce risks. The systematic approach to murder had reached a level of sophistication that was unprecedented in organized crime. The financial success of Roy DeMeo's criminal operations during the 1970s allowed crew members to live lifestyles that were lavish even by the standards of successful organized crime figures. The combination of diverse income streams, efficient operations, and minimal law enforcement interference generated cash flows that supported extremely comfortable lives for Roy and his closest associates. Roy himself lived in a manner befitting his status as one of Brooklyn's most successful criminals. His home was expensively furnished and equipped with security systems that reflected both his wealth and his awareness of the risks associated with his activities. He drove expensive cars, wore expensive clothes, and frequented expensive restaurants and nightclubs throughout New York. The crew's financial success also enabled them to bribe law enforcement officials, court personnel, and other individuals whose cooperation was valuable for their operations. The systematic bribery of key officials created networks of protection that made it extremely difficult for honest law enforcement officers to build effective cases against the crew. The lavish lifestyles were not just personal indulgences. They were also business investments that enhanced the crew's reputation and attracted potential recruits who were impressed by the apparent rewards of criminal success. The visible wealth of crew members served as advertising for their criminal organization, demonstrating that loyalty and effectiveness were rewarded with financial prosperity. Roy DeMeo's approach to recruiting new crew members reflected his understanding that successful criminal organizations required individuals with specific skills and psychological characteristics. Unlike some criminal groups that recruited based on personal relationships or neighborhood connections, Roy evaluated potential members based on their ability to contribute to the crew's operations and their reliability under pressure. The recruitment process typically began with the identification of individuals who had demonstrated relevant skills or characteristics in other contexts. These might include people who had shown a willingness to use violence, individuals with technical skills that could be useful for specific operations, or people with connections to legitimate businesses that could serve as fronts for criminal activities. Potential recruits were carefully evaluated over extended periods before being given access to sensitive information about the crew's operations. This evaluation process helped ensure that new members were both competent and trustworthy, reducing the risk of infiltration by law enforcement agents or the recruitment of individuals who might become liabilities. The crew's organizational structure reflected Roy's business-oriented approach to criminal management. Different members had specific roles and responsibilities that matched their skills and temperaments. This specialization increased efficiency while creating redundancy that ensured operations could continue even if individual members were arrested or eliminated. Roy DeMeo's crew operated in a complex environment where relationships with other criminal organizations ranged from cooperation to competition to outright warfare. The crew's reputation for effectiveness made them valuable allies, but also dangerous competitors, creating a delicate balance of relationships that required constant management and adjustment. Cooperation with other criminal organizations was often based on mutual benefit rather than friendship or loyalty. The crew's specialized capabilities made them valuable partners for organizations that needed problems solved but lacked the expertise or willingness to handle certain types of operations themselves. These partnerships generated income while reducing conflicts that might otherwise have led to violence. Competition with other criminal groups was generally managed through a combination of superior capabilities and strategic alliances rather than direct confrontation. Roy understood that open warfare with other organizations would attract law enforcement attention and disrupt the profitable operations that were the crew's primary focus. The crew's relationship with law enforcement was similarly complex. While they were obviously adversaries in a fundamental sense, the crew's systematic approach to eliminating evidence and witnesses made it extremely difficult for law enforcement agencies to build prosecutable cases. The resulting standoff created a form of mutual respect between professional adversaries who understood each other's capabilities and limitations. Roy DeMeo's appointment to handle the Gambino family's relationship with the Westies, the violent Irish-American gang that controlled much of Manhattan's West Side, represented both a mark of trust from the family, leadership, and a significant challenge that would test his diplomatic and organizational skills. The Westies were notorious for their unpredictability and extreme violence, characteristics that made them valuable allies but difficult partners. Their control of valuable territory in Manhattan made them important to the Gambino family's interests, but their tendency toward public violence and media attention made them problematic from an operational security standpoint. Roy's approach to managing the Westies' relationship reflected his systematic approach to all business relationships. He worked to establish clear expectations and boundaries while providing the Westies with opportunities to profit from their association with the Gambino family. The relationship was managed as a business partnership rather than a personal friendship, with specific agreements about territorial boundaries, revenue sharing, and operational coordination. The success of Roy's management of the Westies' relationship enhanced his reputation within the Gambino family while demonstrating his ability to handle complex diplomatic challenges that might have created problems for less skilled operators. However, the association with the Westies also exposed Roy to additional law enforcement scrutiny and created relationships that would eventually contribute to his downfall. Throughout the peak period of his criminal career, Roy DeMeo continued to innovate and improve the methods used by his crew for various criminal activities. This was not just a matter of personal pride. It was a business necessity in an environment where law enforcement techniques were constantly evolving and where competitive advantages were essential for survival and prosperity. The crew's car theft operations incorporated new technologies and techniques as they became available. Electronic devices for bypassing ignition systems, sophisticated methods for altering vehicle identification numbers, and improved transportation networks for moving stolen vehicles all contributed to the operation's continued success and growth. The murder and disposal methods that had made Roy's crew famous throughout the criminal underworld were similarly subject to continuous improvement and refinement. New tools and techniques were evaluated and incorporated when they offered advantages in terms of efficiency, security, or effectiveness. The crew's legitimate business operations also benefited from Roy's innovative approach to criminal enterprise. Money laundering techniques were constantly updated to stay ahead of law enforcement detection methods. Business structures were modified to provide better protection for the crew's criminal activities, while maximizing the tax and legal advantages available to legitimate businesses. Roy DeMeo's effectiveness. As a leader of one of organized crime's most successful crews reflected his understanding of the psychological factors that motivated criminal behavior and his ability to create organizational structures that channeled these motivations toward productive outcomes. Roy understood that most criminals were motivated by a combination of financial opportunity, respect from peers, and the excitement of operating outside conventional social boundaries. He created an organizational environment that provided all of these motivations while maintaining the discipline and security necessary for long-term success. The crew's financial success provided obvious motivation for continued loyalty and effective performance. Members who contributed to the crew's success were rewarded with substantial income that enabled lifestyles that would have been impossible through legitimate employment opportunities available to men from their backgrounds. The respect and fear generated by the crew's reputation provided psychological rewards that were often as important as financial compensation. Members of Roy's crew enjoyed a status within their communities that reflected their association with one of the most feared criminal organizations in New York. The systematic approach to criminal activities provided intellectual challenges that appealed to crew members who might otherwise have been bored by more conventional criminal pursuits. The complexity of planning and executing sophisticated criminal operations provided mental stimulation that kept talented individuals engaged and committed to the organization's success. By the early 1980s, the systematic violence that had made Roy DeMeo's crew the most feared criminal organization in New York was beginning to attract the kind of sustained law enforcement attention that threatened their continued operations. The sheer number of disappearances associated with the crew's activities had created a pattern that even the most overwhelmed police departments could not ignore indefinitely. The formation of specialized organized crime task forces during the late 1970s had created new challenges for criminal organizations that had previously operated with relative impunity. These task forces combined resources from multiple agencies, shared intelligence across jurisdictional boundaries, and focused sustained attention on specific criminal organizations rather than investigating individual crimes in isolation. Roy's crew found themselves the subject of increasingly sophisticated surveillance operations that used new technologies and techniques to penetrate the security measures that had previously protected their activities. Electronic surveillance, improved photographic equipment, and better coordination between agencies created an investigative environment that was far more threatening than anything the crew had previously encountered. The crew's legitimate business operations, which had previously provided cover for their criminal activities, were increasingly subject to scrutiny from tax authorities, licensing agencies, and other regulatory bodies. What had once been assets were becoming liabilities as investigators used business records and financial transactions to build cases that could not be defeated simply by eliminating witnesses and physical evidence. The increasing law enforcement attention focused on Roy DeMeo's crew was creating significant problems for the Gambino crime family's leadership. Paul Castellano, who had become the family's boss following Carlo Gambino's death in 1976, was increasingly concerned about the risks associated with Roy's operations and their potential impact on the family's other activities. Castellano's approach to organized crime emphasized profit over violence, and he viewed Roy's systematic approach to murder as an unnecessary risk that generated heat without providing corresponding benefits. The boss preferred criminal activities that generated substantial revenue with minimal law enforcement attention. such as construction industry corruption, labor union infiltration, and sophisticated white-collar crimes. The tension between Castellano's vision of modern organized crime and Roy's methods created an increasingly unstable situation within the family hierarchy. Roy's crew continued to generate substantial revenue for the organization, but their activities were also creating risks that threatened the family's long-term interests and the safety of other members. Other ranking members of the Gambino family were also expressing concerns about Roy's operations and their potential consequences. The systematic elimination of so many people had created a level of law enforcement interest it was affecting the entire organization's ability to operate effectively. What had once been viewed as Roy's greatest strength was increasingly seen as his most dangerous liability. Roy DeMeo's continued involvement in drug trafficking, despite traditional Mafia prohibitions against narcotics dealing, created additional tensions within the Gambino family and exposed the crew to enhanced law enforcement scrutiny. The drug trade attracted the attention of federal agencies with resources and legal authorities that the local police departments lacked. The profits from drug dealing were substantial, but they came with risks that traditional organized crime activities did not involve. Drug trafficking attracted mandatory minimum sentences that made cooperation with law enforcement more attractive to arrested individuals. The federal agencies that investigated drug crimes had broader investigative powers and more sophisticated techniques than local police departments. He was specially suited to kill better, more efficiently, and more completely than anyone else in the business. By the early 1970s, Roy DeMeo had made a name for himself as a rising star in the Gambino crime family's work in Brooklyn. His car theft groups were making a lot of money. His illegal money-lending business was growing bigger, and his reputation for being reliable and cruel was spreading through the group. But Roy was not happy with just being a successful criminal. He wanted to be someone they could not do without. He started to actively look for the jobs that other members of the group liked to avoid, the jobs that needed someone willing to cross lines that others would not cross. It was a dangerous plan that would in the end lead to him moving up in the group, and finally, to his downfall. The change from regular organized crime work to murder was not quick. It was a slow increase that showed both Roy's growing importance in the group and his willingness to take on jobs that were more and more dangerous. Each job he did well built his reputation and brought him closer to the inner group of the Gambino family's most trusted members. By the early 1970s, Roy DeMeo had shown he was valuable enough to the Gambino crime family to be given his own crew. This was not just a promotion. It was a sign that Roy had grown into the kind of leader who could be trusted with a lot of responsibility, and more importantly, the chance to make a lot of money. The DeMeo Crew started as a casual group of criminals who thought alike and who shared Roy's desire for violence and money. Unlike regular Mafia crews that might focus on one type of criminal work, Roy's group was very good at many things. They could steal cars, run illegal money-lending businesses, manage illegal gambling, and handle the kind of killing that other crews liked to avoid. The main members of the crew showed Roy's skill for finding people who shared his special mix of smarts and not caring about right or wrong. Anthony Center was a childhood friend from Bath Beach who had grown up in the same area and shared Roy's understanding of how their world really worked. Joseph Testa brought technical skills and a focus on details that worked well with Roy's leadership skills. Chris Rosenberg was young, excited, and completely willing to follow Roy's lead into more and more dangerous situations. What made the DeMeo Crew different from other criminal groups was their planned, step-by-step way of using violence. While other crews might use murder as a last choice, or when they were very angry, Roy's group handled killing with the same careful, step-by-step way they used for stealing cars or lending money illegally. Murder was not an emotional act. It was a business choice, carried out with the efficiency of a factory. The crew setting up the Gemini Lounge as their main office was a big change in both Roy DeMeo's criminal career and the history of organized crime in New York. The Gemini Lounge, in the Canarsie part of Brooklyn, looked like just a normal neighborhood bar. It was a place where local men could have a drink, watch sports, and talk with friends and neighbors. In reality, the Gemini Lounge was something much more evil. It was the main hub of Roy DeMeo's growing criminal empire. It was a place where plans were made, jobs were given out, and problems were solved in a final way that left no chance to argue. The bar's harmless look on the outside hid a level of planned violence that the people in the neighborhood, who sometimes came in for a drink, could never have imagined. The way the Gemini Lounge was built was perfect for its two uses. The main bar area was a cover for meetings and planning, while the back rooms gave them privacy for things that needed to be kept completely secret. Most importantly, the building's basement gave them the space and quiet needed for Roy's most famous new idea, the planned, step-by-step way of getting rid of murder victims. The Gemini Lounge also acted as a place to find new members for the crew's growing businesses. Young men from the neighborhood who were attracted by the success and respect that Roy and his friends seemed to have would slowly be pulled into the group's work. What started as small favors or small criminal jobs would eventually grow into being a full part of the crew's most serious crimes. In the middle of 1977, Roy DeMeo got the honor he had been working toward for years. He was officially made a member of the Gambino crime family. This was not just a special honor. It was a sign that Roy had shown he was deserving of the trust and responsibility that came with being a full member in one of America's most powerful criminal groups. The ceremony itself was a carefully planned event that stressed the serious nature of the promises Roy was making. Surrounded by high-ranking members of the Gambino family, Roy took the traditional promise of loyalty, secrecy, and obedience that tied him to the group for life. The ritual of burning a picture of a saint, while Roy held it in his cupped hands, was a clear reminder of what would happen to him if he ever broke the trust he was being given. But with the honor of being made a member came new responsibilities and things that were expected of him. Roy was put in charge of handling all Gambino family business with the Westies, the violent Irish-American gang that controlled a lot of Manhattan's West Side. This job was both a sign of trust and a test. The Westies were known for being very hard to work with, and managing the relationship needed someone with Roy's special mix of talking skills and a believable threat of violence. The job also gave Roy a chance to get into more profitable criminal opportunities and more freedom in how he chose to do them. As a made member of the family, his word was important in arguments. His protection now covered his friends, and his ability to make money grew a lot. It was everything he had worked for. But it also meant that his actions now directly affected the reputation and goals of the whole Gambino organization. Even though the Mafia traditionally had a rule against selling drugs, Roy DeMeo's crew got very involved in the drug trade during the late 1970s. This was not just a casual breaking of family rules. It was a planned business choice based on Roy's belief that the money from selling drugs was much more than the risks of being caught and punished. The drug businesses were run with the same planned step-by-step way that was typical of all of Roy's criminal jobs. Instead of selling drugs on the street, the crew focused on selling large amounts, which made the most money with the least amount of risk. They made deals with suppliers, set up ways to distribute the drugs, and created systems for cleaning the money that let them enjoy their profits without getting unwanted attention. Roy's choice to get into the drug trade showed his practical way of thinking about organized crime. He knew that traditional Mafia businesses, like lending money illegally and illegal gambling, while they made money, had limits on how much they could grow. The drug trade offered chances for growth and profit that just did not exist in other areas of crime. But getting involved in drug dealing also caused problems within the Gambino family. The traditional rule against drugs was not just a moral belief. It was a practical understanding that drug dealing brought a lot of attention from the police, which could put the group's other businesses at risk. Roy's breaking of this rule would eventually add to the suspicion and fear that would in the end lead to his downfall. Roy DeMeo's first murder, which he did in 1973 when he was 30 years old, was the start of a killing spree that would eventually take over 200 lives. The victim was a small-time criminal who had made the deadly mistake of trying to force one of Roy's friends to give him money. It was a pretty simple killing by organized crime standards, but it set the ways and examples that would be a part of all of Roy's later murders. What made this first killing different from typical Mafia murders was not just how well it was done, but the complete disappearance of the victim's body. While most organized crime murders were meant to send messages to possible enemies or rivals, Roy's way was different. He understood that no body, no crime, was not just a clever saying. It was a practical way to handle murder that lowered legal risks while having the biggest psychological effect. Successfully getting rid of the first victim's body proved Roy's ideas about how murder could be made better through planned, step-by-step thinking and action. Instead of just shooting someone and leaving the body to be found, Roy had created ways to make people disappear so completely that their families never knew for sure what had happened to them. The psychological effect of someone completely disappearing was often more scary than a regular murder. When bodies were found, families and friends could at least have some sense of being finished with it. When people just disappeared without a sign, the not knowing and fear lasted forever. Everyone who knew the victim was left wondering if they might be next, and if they too might just disappear one day without any explanation. Roy DeMeo's most famous new idea was creating what became known as the Gemini method, a planned, step-by-step way of murder and getting rid of the body that got rid of physical evidence, while having the biggest psychological effect on possible enemies. The method was created through trying things out and making mistakes over several years, with Roy always making the process better based on what he learned from doing it. The Gemini method started with choosing victims who could be tricked into coming to the Gemini Lounge with a false story. This got rid of the risks of committing murders in places that could not be predicted. Roy's violation of family rules regarding drug dealing also created internal political problems that went beyond immediate operational concerns. Other family members who had followed the traditional prohibition against narcotics felt that Roy was receiving special treatment that put their own activities at risk. The resentment created by this perceived favoritism contributed to the growing internal opposition to Roy's continued operations. The drug trade also brought Roy's crew into contact with criminal organizations and individuals who did not share the traditional organized crime values of secrecy and loyalty. Drug dealers were more likely to cooperate with law enforcement when arrested, creating additional risks for everyone involved in the operations. The combination of increasing law enforcement pressure and internal family tensions created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust within Roy DeMeo's crew that began to affect their operational effectiveness. Members who had once worked together with complete confidence began to question each other's loyalty and reliability. Roy himself became increasingly suspicious of both law enforcement surveillance and potential betrayal by his own associates. The systematic approach that had characterized his criminal operations began to give way to more impulsive and emotional decision-making. As the pressure mounted and options became limited, the crew's legendary discipline and operational security began to deteriorate. Under the strain of constant pressure and uncertainty, communications that had once been carefully planned and executed became more casual and potentially compromising. Security measures that had been rigorously maintained began to relax as paranoia and fear affected judgment and decision-making. The psychological pressure was particularly intense because crew members understood that their systematic elimination of witnesses and evidence had created a situation where surrender or cooperation with law enforcement was not a realistic option. They had burned bridges that could not be rebuilt, creating a situation where continued criminal activity was their only viable choice, regardless of the risks involved. Paul Castellano's growing discomfort with Roy DeMeo's methods and their consequences created a fundamental conflict that could not be resolved through traditional family diplomatic channels. Castellano viewed Roy as a valuable earner who had become a dangerous liability. But the boss's options for dealing with the situation were limited by Roy's popularity among other family members and his continued financial contributions to the organization. The traditional solution for dealing with problematic family members was elimination. But Roy's reputation and capabilities made this option more complex than it might otherwise have been. Any attempt to kill Roy would require careful planning and execution, and failure would create additional problems for the family leadership. Castellano's business-oriented approach to organized crime was also fundamentally incompatible with Roy's systematic use of violence as a solution to business problems. The boss preferred negotiation, corruption, and sophisticated fraud to the direct confrontation and elimination that characterized Roy's operations. The growing tension between Castellano and Roy was evident to other family members, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty and instability that affected the entire organization's operations. Members were forced to choose sides or attempt to remain neutral in a conflict that seemed likely to result in violence, regardless of how it was ultimately resolved. The sustained investigative attention focused on Roy DeMeo's crew began to produce results that threatened the organization's continued existence. Surveillance operations were gathering evidence of criminal activities that could not be explained away as legitimate business operations. Electronic surveillance was capturing conversations that revealed the crew's involvement in activities that had previously been matters of speculation. The development of new forensic techniques also created threats that the crew's disposal methods could not completely eliminate. Advances in DNA analysis, improved methods for recovering trace evidence, and better techniques for identifying human remains made complete disposal of evidence more difficult than it had been during the crew's early years. Law enforcement agencies were also benefiting from improved intelligence sharing and coordination between different jurisdictions. Information that might not have been significant to a local police department could become crucial when combined with evidence gathered by federal agencies or investigators in other states. The crew's systematic approach to criminal activity, which had been one of their greatest strengths, was also creating vulnerabilities that skilled investigators could exploit. Patterns in their operations that had once been invisible were becoming apparent to investigators who had the time and resources to analyze large amounts of information over extended periods. Chris Rosenberg's increasing recklessness and lack of discipline created additional problems for Roy DeMeo's crew at a time when they could least afford any additional complications. Rosenberg's involvement in unauthorized activities, his casual attitude toward operational security, and his apparent belief that his association with Roy made him untouchable created risks that threatened the entire organization. Rosenberg's drug-dealing activities were conducted with a level of openness that attracted law enforcement attention and violated the crew's traditional emphasis on discretion and security. His relationships with unreliable associates and his tendency to discuss crew activities with people outside the organization created additional vulnerabilities that investigators could exploit. This situation was complicated by Rosenberg's value to the crew's operations and his personal relationship with Roy. Despite his problems, Rosenberg was an effective operator who had contributed significantly to the crew's success. His elimination would deprive the organization of a valuable asset while potentially creating additional law enforcement interest. Roy's handling of the Rosenberg situation would ultimately demonstrate the extent to which external pressures and internal paranoia were affecting his judgment and decision-making. The systematic approach that had characterized his previous operations gave way to more emotional and potentially counterproductive responses to problems that might have been handled differently under less stressful circumstances. The increasing law enforcement attention and internal family tensions were beginning to affect the crew's ability to generate the profits that had once made them valuable to the Gambino family leadership. Operations that had previously run smoothly were encountering obstacles and complications that reduced their efficiency and profitability. Car theft operations were becoming more difficult and dangerous as law enforcement agencies improved their investigative techniques and coordination. Vehicles that might once have been processed and disposed of quickly were taking longer to handle, increasing the risks and costs associated with the operation. The murder-for-hire business was also suffering as potential clients became more cautious about associating with an organization that was attracting significant law enforcement attention. The crew's reputation for effectiveness was being balanced against concerns about the risks of doing business with them. The legitimate business operations that had once provided cover and money laundering opportunities were increasingly subject to regulatory scrutiny that made them less useful for their intended purposes. What had once been assets were becoming liabilities that required management attention without providing corresponding benefits. By 1982, the combination of external pressures and internal conflicts had created a situation where Roy DeMeo's continued existence was becoming problematic for everyone involved. The Gambino family leadership viewed him as a liability that threatened their other operations. Law enforcement agencies viewed him as a priority target whose elimination would represent a significant victory in their war against organized crime. Roy himself was caught between these competing pressures, with limited options for resolving the situation. His systematic elimination of witnesses and evidence had created a situation where surrender or cooperation with law enforcement was not realistic. His violation of family rules and creation of internal conflicts made it impossible to simply reduce his activities and hope the problems would resolve themselves. The crew's legendary effectiveness and reputation for violence, which had once been their greatest assets, had become their most dangerous liabilities. The fear they had once inspired in enemies was now being directed at them by former allies, who viewed them as threats to their own survival and prosperity. The systematic approach to criminal activity that had made Roy DeMeo's crew the most feared organization in American organized crime had also created patterns and vulnerabilities that skilled investigators could exploit. The very efficiency and organization that had been their strength was becoming the foundation for cases that might finally bring them to justice. The stage was set for the final act in Roy DeMeo's criminal career, a resolution that would satisfy the competing demands of law enforcement, agencies seeking justice and crime family leaders seeking to protect their own interests. The only question was whether Roy would recognize the reality of his situation in time to take action that might preserve his life, if not his freedom. As 1983 began, Roy DeMeo found himself in an impossible position that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The man who had once been one of the most feared and respected figures in organized crime was now trapped between competing forces that were all working toward his destruction. The law enforcement task force pursuing him was closer than ever to building prosecutable cases, while members of his own crime family had concluded that his continued existence posed unacceptable risks to their operations. The psychological pressure on Roy during this period was immense. For over a decade, he had been accustomed to being the predator rather than the prey, the man who decided who lived and who died. Now he found himself looking over his shoulder constantly, wondering which of his associates might be planning his elimination, and whether the next meeting he attended might be his last. The systematic approach to problem solving that had characterized Roy's entire criminal career seemed inadequate to address the situation he now faced. The methods that had worked for dealing with individual enemies, or specific law enforcement investigations, were not effective against the coordinated campaign that was being directed against him from multiple directions simultaneously. Roy's isolation was becoming more complete with each passing day. Associates who had once been eager to meet with him were now finding excuses to avoid contact. Business partners were distancing themselves from operations that might connect them to his activities. Even family members were beginning to limit their interactions with him to avoid being caught up in whatever fate awaited him. The law enforcement investigation that had been building against Roy DeMeo's crew for years was finally reaching the point where arrests and indictments were imminent. The systematic surveillance, financial investigations, and intelligence gathering that had been conducted by multiple agencies were beginning to produce the evidence necessary for prosecution. The investigators had developed a comprehensive understanding of the crew's operations, organizational structure, and methods. They had identified patterns in the disappearances that could be connected to specific crew members. They had gathered financial evidence that demonstrated the crew's involvement in various criminal activities. Most importantly, they had identified potential witnesses who might be willing to testify about what they had observed. The breakthrough that law enforcement had been seeking for years was finally within reach. The systematic approach that Roy had used to eliminate evidence and witnesses was proving insufficient against investigators who had the time, resources, and legal authority to build cases based on patterns of criminal activity rather than individual crimes. Roy was aware that the investigation was reaching its climax, but his options for responding were extremely limited. His systematic elimination of witnesses had made it impossible for him to surrender and negotiate a plea agreement. His violation of family rules and creation of internal conflicts had eliminated the possibility of receiving protection from the Gambino organization. Paul Castellano's decision regarding Roy DeMeo's fate was not made impulsively or emotionally. It was the end result of a careful analysis of the costs and benefits of various options available to the Gambino family leadership. From Castellano's perspective, Roy had become a liability that threatened the organization's long-term survival and prosperity. The systematic violence that had made Roy's crew famous throughout the criminal underworld was now attracting exactly the kind of law enforcement attention that Castellano had been trying to avoid. The boss's vision of modern organized crime emphasized profit over violence, and Roy's methods were fundamentally incompatible with this approach. The decision to eliminate Roy was also influenced by practical considerations related to organizational security and stability. Roy's knowledge of family operations and his potential vulnerability to law enforcement pressure made him a security risk that could not be tolerated indefinitely. His elimination would remove this risk while demonstrating to other family members the consequences of activities that threatened the organization's interests. Castellano's order for Roy's elimination was carefully planned to minimize the risks and complications that might result from killing such a prominent and dangerous family member. The boss understood that failure would create additional problems for the organization, while success would resolve multiple issues simultaneously. The meeting at Patty Testa's house on January 10, 1983, was arranged under the pretense of discussing routine crew business. But Roy DeMeo had growing suspicions that something more significant was planned. His survival instincts, honed by years of criminal activity and the systematic elimination of enemies, were warning him that the situation was more dangerous than it appeared. Roy's decision to attend the meeting despite his suspicions reflected the limited options available to him. Refusing to attend would have confirmed his disloyalty and accelerated the timeline for his elimination. Attending offered at least some possibility of survival, even if the odds were increasingly poor. The other attendees at the meeting included several of Roy's closest associates, men who had worked with him for years and shared in the profits of his criminal operations. Their presence at what would become his execution demonstrated the extent to which loyalty and personal relationships were subordinated to organizational necessities in the world of organized crime. Roy's way of acting during his final hours reflected his understanding of the situation he faced and his acceptance of the realities of the life he had chosen. He had spent years systematically eliminating enemies and solving problems through violence. Now he was facing the same solution from the perspective of the problem rather than the solver. The murder of Roy DeMeo was carried out by members of his own crew, men who had worked closely with him and benefited from his leadership and expertise. This was not a case of external enemies finally achieving their revenge. It was the ultimate expression of organizational loyalty, overriding personal relationships. The execution was planned and carried out with the same systematic efficiency that had characterized Roy's own approach to murder. The location was chosen for its security and privacy. The method was selected for its reliability and certainty. The disposal was arranged to send appropriate messages while minimizing law enforcement complications. The irony of Roy's death was not lost on those who understood the full context of his criminal career. The man who had perfected the art of making people disappear permanently was himself eliminated using methods that bore striking similarities to his own innovations. The systematic approach to murder that he had developed was ultimately used to solve the problem that he had become. The execution of Roy DeMeo represented the end of an era in American organized crime. The systematic violence that had made him famous was passing out of fashion as crime family leaders recognized the law enforcement attention and internal complications that such methods created. His death marked the beginning of a transition toward more sophisticated and less violent approaches to criminal activity. The discovery of Roy DeMeo's bullet-riddled body in the trunk of his Cadillac, parked in the lot of a Brooklyn boat club, was filled with special meaning that was not lost on law enforcement investigators or members of the criminal community. The man who had made a career of ensuring that his victims were never found had been left in a location where discovery was certain. The condition and location of Roy's body sent clear messages to multiple audiences. To law enforcement, it represented the conclusion of a criminal career that had long frustrated their investigative efforts. To other members of organized crime, it demonstrated the consequences of activities that created problems for crime family leadership. To potential successors, it showed the ultimate futility of believing that criminal success provided protection against organizational necessities. The investigation of Roy's murder was complicated by the same factors that had made this investigation of his victim's death so difficult. Witnesses were reluctant to cooperate with law enforcement. Physical evidence was limited by the careful planning that had gone into the execution. The systematic elimination of potential sources of information had created an investigative environment where certainty was difficult to achieve. The discovery of Roy's body also marked the beginning of a new phase in law enforcement's investigation of his crew's activities. With their leader dead, the remaining crew members were more vulnerable to pressure and potentially more willing to cooperate with investigators seeking to build cases against other organized crime figures. The elimination of Roy DeMeo created a power vacuum within his crew that could not be easily filled by any of his surviving associates. The systematic approach to criminal activity that had made the crew so effective had been largely dependent on Roy's leadership, organizational skills, and reputation for ruthless efficiency. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, Roy's most trusted lieutenants, attempted to maintain some continuity in the crew's operations, but they lacked both Roy's strategic vision and his ability to command respect from other criminal organizations. The murder-for-hire business that had been one of the crew's most profitable activities essentially disappeared with Roy's death. The remaining crew members also faced increased law enforcement scrutiny as investigators sought to exploit the organizational disruption created by Roy's elimination. Without their leader's guidance and protection, individual crew members were more vulnerable to arrest, prosecution, and the pressure to cooperate with law enforcement investigations. The crew's legitimate business operations, which had once provided cover and income for their criminal activities, began to deteriorate without Roy's management and vision. What had once been an integrated criminal enterprise began to fragment into smaller, less effective operations that lacked the coordination and efficiency that had made Roy's organization so successful. Roy DeMeo's death represented a significant victory for the law. Enforcement agencies that had been investigating his activities for years, but it also created new challenges and opportunities. The systematic violence that had made Roy so difficult to investigate had ended, but the remaining crew members still possessed knowledge and capabilities that could be dangerous if not properly addressed. The investigation of Roy's murder provided law enforcement with new insights into the internal dynamics of organized crime families and the methods used to resolve conflicts within criminal organizations. This intelligence would prove valuable for future investigations and prosecutions of other organized crime figures. The elimination of Roy DeMeo also removed one of the most effective criminal operators in the country, disrupting criminal networks and operations that had been generating substantial profits for organized crime families. The long-term impact of his death would be felt throughout the East Coast criminal underworld for years to come. However, law enforcement agencies also recognized that Roy's elimination had been ordered by crime family leadership primarily to protect their own interests rather than to cooperate with law enforcement. The organizational structure and values that had produced Roy DeMeo remained intact, creating the possibility that similar figures might emerge in the future. The death of Roy DeMeo marked the end of an era in American organized crime, representing the conclusion of a period when systematic violence was viewed as an acceptable tool for solving business problems. Crime family leaders had concluded that the law enforcement attention and internal complications created by such methods outweighed their benefits. The transition away from systematic violence toward more sophisticated criminal methods had been underway for several years. But Roy's elimination accelerated this trend by removing one of the most prominent advocates and practitioners of the old approach. Future criminal operations would emphasize stealth, corruption, and white-collar crime over direct confrontation and elimination of problems. The impact of Roy's criminal innovations would continue to influence organized crime long after his death. The systematic approach to evidence elimination and witness intimidation that he had developed would be studied and adapted by other criminal organizations seeking to avoid law enforcement, detection, and prosecution. The psychological impact of Roy's career on both law enforcement and organized crime would also prove lasting. His systematic approach to murder had demonstrated the potential for criminal organizations to operate with unprecedented efficiency and brutality. His ultimate elimination showed that even the most successful and feared criminals were vulnerable to the competing interests and pressures that governed their world. The death of Roy DeMeo did not end the legal reckoning for his crew's decade-long reign of terror. In fact, his elimination provided law enforcement agencies with the opportunity they had been seeking to dismantle the entire organization and bring its surviving members to justice. The systematic investigations that had been building cases against the crew for years finally began to bear fruit in a series of prosecutions that would reshape the landscape of organized crime in New York. The trials of Roy's surviving associates revealed the full scope of the crew's activities to a public that had been largely unaware of the industrial scale murder operation that had been conducted in their midst. Anthony Center and Joseph Testa, Roy's most trusted lieutenants, were ultimately convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Their convictions were based on testimony from former associates, physical evidence that had survived the crew's disposal methods, and the systematic patterns of criminal activity that investigators had documented over years of patient investigation. The legal proceedings also provided unprecedented insights into the methods and motivations that had driven one of the most effective criminal organizations in American history. Court testimony revealed the mechanical precision with which the crew had approached murder, the business calculations that had determined who lived and who died, and the organizational structure that had enabled such systematic violence to continue for over a decade. The convictions of crew members represented more than individual victories for law enforcement. They demonstrated that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be penetrated and defeated by patient, systematic investigation. The methods that Roy DeMeo had used to avoid prosecution had proven insufficient against investigators who had the time, resources, and legal authority to build comprehensive cases based on patterns of criminal activity. Paul Castellano's decision to eliminate Roy DeMeo represented more than the resolution of an individual personnel problem. It marked the beginning of a broader transformation in the Gambino crime family's approach to criminal activity. The systematic violence that had characterized Roy's operations was increasingly viewed as counterproductive in an era when law enforcement agencies were becoming more sophisticated and aggressive in their investigations of organized crime. The family's leadership implemented new policies and procedures designed to prevent the emergence of another Roy DeMeo-style operation within their organization. These changes emphasized profit over violence, discretion over intimidation, and long-term sustainability over short-term effectiveness. The era of making problems disappear through systematic murder was ending, replaced by more sophisticated approaches to criminal activity that generated substantial profits with minimal law enforcement attention. The elimination of Roy's crew also removed a significant source of internal tension within the Gambino family. Other family members who had been concerned about the risks created by Roy's activities could now focus on their own operations without worrying about the collateral consequences of his systematic violence. The organizational stability that had been threatened by Roy's methods was restored through his elimination. However, the loss of Roy's crew also deprived the Gambino family of one of their most effective revenue-generating operations. The car theft rings, loan sharking operations, and murder-for-hire business that had generated millions of dollars in income were essentially eliminated along with their leadership. The family would need to develop new sources of income to replace what had been lost through Roy's elimination. The Roy DeMeo case fundamentally changed how law enforcement agencies approached organized crime investigations. The systematic methods that Roy had used to eliminate evidence and witnesses had forced investigators to develop new techniques and strategies that would prove valuable in future cases against other criminal organizations. The success of the multi-agency task force approach that had been used against Roy's crew became a model for subsequent organized crime investigations. The sharing of intelligence, resources, and expertise across jurisdictional boundaries had proven more effective than the traditional approach of individual agencies working in isolation. The case also demonstrated the importance of patient, long-term investigation strategies that focused on patterns of criminal activity rather than individual crimes. The systematic approach to evidence gathering that had ultimately defeated Roy's crew would become standard practice for law enforcement agencies investigating sophisticated criminal organizations. The development of new investigative techniques during the investigation of Roy's activities provided law enforcement with capabilities that would prove valuable in future cases. Advances in DNA analysis, improved methods for recovering trace evidence, and better techniques for identifying human remains all emerged from the challenges posed by Roy's disposal methods. The psychological profiling techniques that had been used to understand Roy's methods and predict his behavior also represented significant advances in law enforcement capabilities. The insights gained from studying his systematic approach to violence would prove valuable for investigating other serial killers and violent criminal organizations. The revelation of Roy DeMeo's activities and methods captured the public's imagination in ways that typical organized crime stories rarely achieved. The systematic nature of his violence, the industrial efficiency of his disposal methods, and the sheer number of his victims created a level of fascination that extended far beyond the usual audience for crime stories. Books, documentaries, and films about Roy's criminal career would continue to appear for decades after his death, each attempting to explain how such systematic violence could occur in modern urban America. The story of the DeMeo Crew became a cautionary tale about the potential for ordinary neighborhoods to harbor extraordinary evil. The public fascination with Roy's story reflected broader concerns about urban crime, the effectiveness of law enforcement, and the hidden dangers that might exist in seemingly normal communities. The Gemini Lounge, which had appeared to be nothing more than a neighborhood bar, became a symbol of how criminal organizations could operate undetected in plain sight. The media coverage of Roy's activities also contributed to changes in how organized crime was portrayed in popular culture. The romanticized image of the honorable gangster who operated according to traditional codes of conduct was replaced by a more realistic understanding of organized crime as a business that used violence as a tool for profit maximization. Roy DeMeo's systematic approach to murder and body disposal influenced criminal methods long after his death. Other criminal organizations studied his techniques and adapted them for their own purposes, while also learning from the mistakes that had ultimately led to his downfall. The emphasis on eliminating physical evidence and witnesses became standard practice for sophisticated criminal organizations seeking to avoid law enforcement detection. The businesslike approach to violence that Roy had pioneered influenced how other criminals thought about the use of force as a tool for achieving organizational objectives. However, other criminal organizations also learned from Roy's ultimate fate that systematic violence created its own vulnerabilities. The law enforcement attention and internal organizational tensions that had contributed to his elimination served as warnings about the long-term consequences of such methods. The evolution of criminal methods following Roy's death reflected a broader trend toward more sophisticated and less violent approaches to illegal activity. White-collar crime, cybercrime, and other forms of criminal activity that generated substantial profits with minimal violence became more attractive alternatives to the direct confrontation methods that Roy had employed. The human cost of Roy DeMeo's criminal career extended far beyond his direct victims to include the families and communities that were affected by his activities. The systematic elimination of over 200 people created waves of grief and uncertainty that continued long after Roy's death. Many families never achieved closure regarding the fate of their missing relatives. The effectiveness of Roy's disposal methods meant that bodies were never recovered, leaving families to wonder indefinitely about what had happened to their loved ones. This uncertainty was often more painful than definitive knowledge of death would have been. The communities where Roy's crew had operated were also permanently changed by the revelation of what had been happening in their midst. Neighborhoods that had seemed safe and normal were forced to confront the reality that systematic murder had been conducted in their local establishments for over a decade. The psychological impact on survivors extended beyond immediate family members to include friends, associates, and community members who had known the victims. The knowledge that people they had known and cared about had been systematically eliminated created lasting trauma that affected entire communities. The Roy DeMeo case provided law enforcement agencies with valuable lessons about investigating and prosecuting sophisticated criminal organizations. These lessons would prove crucial for future cases involving organized crime, serial killers, and other criminals who used systematic methods to avoid detection. The importance of interagency cooperation and intelligence sharing was demonstrated clearly by the success of the multi-agency task force approach used against Roy's crew. Future organized crime investigations would routinely employ similar coordination strategies to overcome the jurisdictional limitations that had previously hampered law enforcement efforts. The case also demonstrated the value of focusing on patterns of criminal activity rather than individual crimes when investigating sophisticated criminal organizations. The systematic approach to evidence gathering that had ultimately defeated Roy's crew became a standard practice for law enforcement agencies facing similar challenges. The development of new investigative techniques during the Roy DeMeo investigation provided law enforcement with capabilities that would prove valuable in future cases. Electronic surveillance, financial investigation, and forensic analysis techniques that had been refined during the investigation would become standard tools for organized crime investigations. Roy DeMeo's death marked the end of a particular era in American organized crime, representing the conclusion of a period when systematic violence was viewed as an acceptable and effective tool for achieving criminal objectives. The law enforcement response to his activities had demonstrated that such methods were ultimately self-defeating, creating more problems than they solved. The transition away from systematic violence toward more sophisticated criminal methods that had begun during Roy's lifetime accelerated after his death. Crime families recognized that the law enforcement attention and internal complications created by systematic murder outweighed any benefits such methods might provide. The organizational innovations that Roy had developed, the systematic approach to evidence elimination, the businesslike analysis of criminal opportunities, and the integration of legitimate and illegitimate activities would continue to influence criminal organizations long after his violent methods had been abandoned. The psychological impact of Roy's career on both law enforcement and organized crime would prove lasting. His systematic approach to murder had demonstrated the potential for criminal organizations to operate with unprecedented efficiency and brutality. His ultimate elimination showed that even the most successful and feared criminals were vulnerable to the competing interests and pressures that governed their world. The criminal methods that emerged in the wake of Roy DeMeo's elimination reflected the lessons that organized crime figures had learned from his career and ultimate fate. The emphasis shifted toward criminal activities that generated substantial profits with minimal violence and law enforcement attention. White-collar crime, including sophisticated fraud schemes, money laundering operations, and corruption of public officials, became preferred alternatives to the direct confrontation methods that Roy had employed. These activities offered the potential for substantial profits without the law enforcement scrutiny and internal organizational tensions that systematic violence created. The integration of legitimate and illegitimate business activities that Roy had pioneered continued to be a central feature of modern organized crime operations. However, the emphasis shifted toward using legitimate businesses for money laundering and market manipulation rather than as covers for systematic violence. The systematic approach to criminal activity that Roy had developed also continued to influence organized crime, but it was applied to activities that were less likely to attract law enforcement attention or create internal organizational problems. The businesslike analysis of criminal opportunities became standard practice for sophisticated criminal organizations. The building that once housed the Gemini Lounge still stands in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, but it has been transformed into a different kind of establishment that serves the neighborhood's legitimate residents. The basement where Roy DeMeo perfected his systematic approach to murder and body disposal has been renovated and repurposed for conventional commercial activities. The physical transformation of the building reflects the broader changes that have occurred in the neighborhood and the criminal underworld since Roy's death. What was once a center of systematic violence has become an ordinary commercial establishment that serves the community's legitimate needs. However, the psychological impact of what occurred in the building continues to resonate among those who are aware of its history. The Gemini Lounge remains a symbol of how ordinary places can harbor extraordinary evil and how criminal organizations can operate undetected in the midst of normal communities. The building's current legitimate use also serves as a symbol of the transformation that occurred in organized crime following Roy's elimination. The systematic violence that once characterized criminal activity in the area has been replaced by more conventional forms of illegal activity that do not require specialized facilities for evidence disposal. Law enforcement agencies continue to investigate cold cases that may be connected to Roy DeMeo's crew, seeking to identify additional victims and provide closure for families who lost loved ones during the crew's decade-long reign of terror. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, have provided new opportunities to solve cases that seemed impossible when they were first investigated. The systematic disposal methods that Roy developed have made these continuing investigations extremely challenging, but not impossible. Occasionally, human remains are discovered that can be connected to the crew's activities through forensic analysis and comparison with missing person reports from the relevant time period. The information gathered during the original investigation of Roy's crew continues to provide leads for investigators working on cold cases throughout the Northeast. The systematic nature of the crew's record-keeping has proven valuable for understanding their methods and identifying potential additional victims. These continuing investigations serve both practical and symbolic purposes. They demonstrate law enforcement's commitment to achieving justice for all victims of the crew's activities while also providing closure for families who have waited decades for information about their missing loved ones. Perhaps the greatest irony of Roy DeMeo's criminal career was that the man who had made a profession of ensuring that his victims disappeared without a trace ultimately met his own end in exactly the manner he had perfected for others. The systematic approach to murder that he had developed was ultimately used to solve the problem that he himself had become. Roy's body was discovered in circumstances that bore striking similarities to the disposal methods he had used for his own victims. The symbolic significance of this parallel was not lost on law enforcement investigators or members of the criminal community who understood the full context of his career and elimination. The principle that Roy had lived by no body, no crime ultimately proved insufficient to protect him from the consequences of his actions. While his disposal methods had enabled him to avoid prosecution for specific murders, the pattern of disappearances associated with his activities had created a different kind of evidence that ultimately led to his downfall. The systematic violence that had made Roy one of the most feared figures in organized crime had also made him one of the most vulnerable. The law enforcement attention and internal organizational tensions created by his methods had eliminated his options for survival, creating a situation where his own elimination became inevitable. Roy DeMeo's story has had a lasting impact on how organized crime is portrayed in popular culture, contributing to a more realistic understanding of criminal organizations as businesses that use violence as a tool for profit maximization rather than romantic enterprises, governed by honor codes and traditional values. The systematic nature of Roy's violence and the industrial efficiency of his disposal methods challenged romanticized portrayals of organized crime that had been common in earlier films and books. His story demonstrated that real organized crime was often far more brutal and businesslike than popular culture had typically portrayed. The psychological aspects of Roy's criminal career have also influenced portrayals of serial killers and other violent criminals in popular culture. The combination of intelligence, organizational ability, and complete emotional detachment from violence that characterized his approach to murder has become a template for fictional criminals in various media. The story of the DeMeo Crew continues to fascinate audiences decades after Roy's death, serving as a cautionary tale about the potential for systematic evil to flourish in ordinary communities. The continuing interest in his story reflects broader concerns about urban crime, community safety, and the hidden dangers that may exist in seemingly normal neighborhoods. Roy Albert DeMeo entered the world on a September day in 1940 as just another child, born into a working-class Italian-American family in Brooklyn. He left it 42 years later as one of the most feared and systematic killers in the history of American organized crime. A man whose innovations in murder and body disposal would influence criminal methods for generations to come. The transformation of a butcher's apprentice into the architect of industrial-scale murder represents one of the most chilling examples of how ordinary people can become extraordinary monsters when circumstances, personality, and opportunity align in particularly dangerous ways. Roy's story serves as a reminder that evil often emerges not from dramatic moments of moral choice, but from gradual progressions of small compromises that eventually lead to unthinkable acts. The systematic approach that Roy brought to criminal activity reflected both his intelligence and his complete moral bankruptcy. He understood that murder was simply another business problem that could be solved through careful planning, efficient execution, and systematic disposal of evidence. This cold-blooded approach to violence enabled him to kill on a scale that would have been impossible for someone who viewed murder as an emotional act rather than a business decision. The crew that Roy assembled and led represented a perfect storm of criminal capability, combining technical skills, organizational discipline, and moral flexibility in ways that created an unprecedented capacity for systematic violence. The Gemini Lounge became a factory for death, processing victims with the same efficiency that legitimate businesses applied to manufacturing products or providing services. But Roy's story also demonstrates the ultimate futility of believing that criminal success provides protection against the fundamental realities of life in the underworld. The same systematic violence that made him valuable to organized crime leadership ultimately made him too dangerous to be allowed to live. The law enforcement attention and internal tensions created by his methods sealed his fate as surely as if he had written his own death warrant. The investigation and prosecution of Roy's crew showed that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated by patient, systematic law enforcement efforts. The methods that Roy had developed to avoid prosecution proved insufficient against investigators who had the time, resources, and legal authority to build comprehensive cases based on patterns of criminal activity rather than individual crimes. The human cost of Roy's criminal career extended far beyond the more than 200 people who disappeared at his hands, the families who never learned what happened to their loved ones, the communities that were terrorized by his activities, and the law enforcement officers who spent years pursuing him all paid a price for his systematic approach to violence. Yet Roy's story also serves as a testament to the resilience of justice and the ultimate power of law enforcement institutions to adapt and overcome even the most sophisticated criminal innovations. The techniques developed during the investigation of his activities would prove valuable for future cases against other criminal organizations, while the convictions of his surviving associates demonstrated that accountability could be achieved even years after the crimes were committed. The legacy of Roy DeMeo continues to influence both organized crime and law enforcement decades after his death. His systematic approach to criminal activity has been studied and adapted by other criminal organizations, while his ultimate fate serves as a cautionary tale about the long-term consequences of systematic violence. Law enforcement agencies continue to use techniques developed during the investigation of his activities, while forensic scientists worked to identify additional victims of his crew's systematic murder campaign. In the end, Roy DeMeo's story is a uniquely American tale of ambition, violence, and the pursuit of success without regard for moral boundaries or human consequences. It reflects the dark side of the entrepreneurial spirit that has driven American economic development, showing how the same qualities that create legitimate business success can be twisted to create systematic evil. The boy who learned to cut meat in a Brooklyn butcher shop grew up to become a man who perfected the art of making people disappear forever. The apprentice who mastered the techniques of breaking down animal carcasses became the architect of human disposal methods that horrified even hardened criminals. The neighborhood kid who wanted respect and success achieved both, but at a cost that ultimately consumed him and everyone around him. Roy DeMeo lived by the principle that problems could be solved through systematic violence and careful disposal of evidence. He died when he himself became the problem that needed to be solved. The man who had made a career of ensuring that others would never be found was ultimately discovered in the trunk of his own Cadillac, bullet-riddled and abandoned in a Brooklyn parking lot. The rain still taps on the streets of Brooklyn, mixing with the sounds of city life that continue regardless of the evil that once flourished in ordinary neighborhoods. The building that once housed the Gemini Lounge still stands, serving legitimate purposes for law-abiding citizens who may never know the full history of what occurred there. But the legacy of Roy DeMeo continues to echo, a reminder that in the shadows of even the most ordinary places, extraordinary evil can flourish until justice finally catches up with those who believe they are beyond its reach. The story of Roy DeMeo, the Butcher of Brooklyn, stands as one of the most chilling chapters in the history of American organized crime, a testament to the human capacity for both systematic evil and ultimate justice, played out on the streets of New York, where ambition and violence intersected in ways that forever changed our understanding of what ordinary people can become when they choose to embrace the darkness rather than resist it. The investigation into Roy DeMeo's activities and the prosecution of his surviving associates represented one of the most significant victories in law enforcement's ongoing war against organized crime. While the man himself is long dead, the techniques developed during the investigation of his crew continue to be used in the pursuit of justice, and the families of his victims continue to seek closure for losses that occurred decades ago. The story of the DeMeo Crew serves as both a historical record of a particularly dark chapter in American crime and a reminder that no criminal organization, no matter how sophisticated or ruthless, is ultimately beyond the reach of justice. And there it is, the complete, true story about Roy DeMeo, the butcher who turned Brooklyn into his own personal killing field. But before you click away, I need to ask you something important. What is going through your mind right now? Are you disturbed by how someone could systematically get rid of 200 or more people without any more emotion than someone processing animals? Are you shocked that this factory-like murder operation ran for over a decade in a regular neighborhood? Or maybe you are wondering how many other Roy DeMeos might be out there right now, hidden behind real businesses in your own community. Drop a comment below and tell me your honest reaction. I personally read and reply to every comment because your thoughts often show me things I had not thought of. Some of our best follow-up stories have come directly from what viewers have shared and the questions they have asked. If this kind of deep look into a criminal investigation grabbed you and would not let go, you definitely need to hit that subscribe button and smash that notification bell. Until next time, stay watchful, stay curious, and remember, the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who look completely normal. Sweet dreams, if you can have them after this trip into Brooklyn's heart of darkness.